Welcome, dear listener, to the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, where the tea is strong, the gossip stronger, and even the holly hides a secret or two. Pull up a chair by the fire, for tonight we join Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming knitter of scarves and solver of riddles, in a festive mystery that begins with a twinkle and ends with a gasp. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Ruby. In the heart of England, where the downs roll like sleeping cats under patchwork quilts of snow, lies the village of St. Mary Mead. It is the sort of place where postmen still tip their caps, where the butcher knows which joint you fancy before you open your mouth, and where gossip travels faster than the London train, though never, of course, with malice. Tonight, the village green is transformed into a Christmas card brought to life. Lanterns swing from the branches of the ancient yew that has stood sentinel since the Wars of the Roses. Colored bulbs, red, green, gold, blink like shy courtesans. The scent of mulled wine drifts from the Women's Institute stall, mingling with roasted chestnuts and the sharp, comforting tang of pine. Pull your armchair closer, dear listener. Let the fire settle into its embers. For on this crisp December evening in 1948, something is about to vanish in front of 200 witnesses, and only one pair of mild blue eyes will see how. The hands of the church clock were inching toward 6:30 when Miss Jane Marple arrived at the green. She moved with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has never needed to prove she is in a hurry. Her moss-green wool coat, cut in the fashionable new look, though she would have blushed to hear it called so, was fastened with buttons the size of half-crowns. A damson scarf, hand-knitted in a pattern of blackberry stitch, framed her small, delicately wrinkled face. Her gray hair was pinned beneath a velvet beret the color of holly berries. In her gloved hands she carried a canvas bag containing 2 skeins of wool, a half-finished scarf for the district nurse, and, though no one could have guessed it, a mind sharper than the icicles dangling from the lich gate. She chose a folding chair near the church hall steps, arranged her bag on her lap, and produced her knitting needles. Click, 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 click. The sound was soft, domestic, almost soporific, yet every third stitch paused for the fraction of a heartbeat while Miss Marple's gaze traveled over the crowd with the precision of a lighthouse beam. To her left, the Mrs. Bantry, Dolly and her sister-in-law, were supervising the tombola. Dolly's laugh rang out like a silver bell each time someone won a jar of chutney. Colonel Bantry, ramrod straight in his regimental greatcoat, stood guard over the raffle drum as though it contained state secrets. His mustache bristled with the importance of the occasion. Further along, Mrs. Clarissa Price held court beside the mulled wine cauldron. She wore a mink stole despite the cold. She claimed the fur kept her sinuses clear, and a diamond brooch shaped like a spray of mistletoe. Every gesture scattered light. She was recounting for the 3rd time how she had offered £5,000 for the St. Nicholas ruby only to be refused by the parish council. A museum piece, she declared, not a bauble for a tree. Her voice carried the faint metallic edge of envy. Near the coconut shy, Mr. Reginald Swinnerton, the antique dealer from London, was setting up his puppet theater. He had arrived 2 days earlier in a bottle-green Bentley that caused more comment than the ruby itself. His monocle flashed as he adjusted the miniature proscenium arch. Punch and Judy leered from their hooks, painted mouths agape. Children clustered, noses pink with cold, begging for a preview. Mr. Swinnerton obliged with a flourish of gloved hands. "Gather round, my dears, magic is merely misdirection." His voice was smooth as pomade. Miss Marple's needles clicked on. She noted the way Mr. Swinnerton's left glove was fractionally whiter than the right, newly laundered perhaps, and filed the observation away with the same care she gave to dropped stitches. At the far end of the green, the choir boys were assembling beneath the direction of Miss Evelyn Hart, the village librarian. Miss Hart was tall, angular, and dressed in a coat the color of parchment. Her passion was local history. Her cottage groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes and yellowed maps. Tonight she carried a clipboard and a stopwatch, timing the carols to the second. Tom Fletcher, the youngest choir boy, kept glancing toward the puppet stage. His fingers worried the hem of his cassock. A button dangled by a single thread. Center stage, literally, was the Christmas tree. It had taken 6 men and a Shire horse to drag it from Gossington Woods. 20 feet tall, perfectly symmetrical, it wore its decorations like a duchess. Glass baubles from Bohemia, tinsel spun in Birmingham, and at its crown a velvet circlet the color of spilled claret. Nestled within the circlet, catching every shard of light, was the St. Nicholas ruby. Legend claimed the gem had been prized from the navel of a heathen idol by a pirate named Silas St. Nicholas, who repented on his deathbed and bequeathed it to the church for the salvation of his soul and the delight of the village. Whether the story was true mattered less than the fact that every child in St. Mary Mead had grown up believing it. The ruby was the size of a pigeon's egg, blood red, with a single star-shaped inclusion that winked like a secret. Once a year it was brought from the bank vault in Much Benham, insured for £10,000 and placed on the tree for the lighting ceremony. Tomorrow it would return to its steel box. Tonight it belonged to everyone. The church clock struck the half-hour. Reverend Clement appeared on the church hall steps in surplice and muffler. He raised both hands, plump and pink, as suet puddings. "Friends," his voice boomed across the green, "we gather to celebrate the birth of our Savior and the generosity of Sir Henry Clithering, who has once again donated this magnificent tree. In a moment we shall light it, and with it the St. Nicholas ruby, our village's most treasured heirloom. But first, a carol." The choir boys snapped to attention. Miss Hart's stopwatch clicked. Tom Fletcher's button finally gave up and fell into the snow. "Oh, come, all ye faithful," swelled into the frosty air. Voices rose, some tuneful, some enthusiastic, one or two enthusiastically flat. Miss Marple's lips moved silently with the Latin verses she had learned at her mother's knee. Her eyes, however, never left the tree. Mr. Swinnerton's puppets burst into action. Punch walloped Judy with a slapstick that produced a satisfying thwack. Children shrieked with delight. The distraction was perfect. Reverend Clement gave the signal. The verger, Mr. Polk, threw a switch concealed behind the tombola. A generator coughed. One by one, the colored bulbs on the tree flickered to life, crimson, emerald, gold, sapphire, until the great fir blazed like a jewel box. The crowd gasped in unison. For 3 heartbeats, the ruby crowned the tree in solitary splendor, a drop of fire against the night. Then Mrs. Clarissa Price screamed. The sound cut through the carol like a shard of glass. Heads turned. The choir faltered mid-verse. Punch froze with his stick aloft. "The ruby!" Mrs. Price clutched her mink. "It's gone!" Miss Marple's needles paused. She rose, slowly because haste was vulgar, and peered over the heads of the crowd. The velvet circlet was empty. A single thread of gold tinsel dangled where the gem had been, swaying gently as though the tree itself were bereaved. Colonel Bantry's military bark split the silence. "Nobody move! Lock the gates!" The verger scurried to obey, though the gates were purely decorative and the hedges full of gaps. Children began to cry. Mrs. Price sank onto a folding chair, fanning herself with a hymnal. Miss Hart's stopwatch slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the frozen ground. Tom Fletcher's eyes, wide, dark, and unmistakably terrified, darted to the puppet stage. Mr. Swinnerton was calmly rolling up the proscenium curtain, his movements precise, unhurried. Punch and Judy lay discarded in a heap, their painted grins suddenly macabre. Miss Marple resumed her seat. She counted the stitches aloud under her breath, a habit when her mind was racing. 1, 2, 3. 3 seconds. That was all the time the thief had needed. 3 seconds while 200 pairs of eyes were dazzled by the lights and distracted by the puppets. She looked again at the empty circlet. No broken wire, no shattered glass. The ruby had not been cut free, it had been lifted. A sleight of hand in full view of the village. The choir boys were being herded into the church hall for hot cocoa. Mrs. Price was revived with brandy. Colonel Bantry organized a search party with the efficiency of a man who had once stormed beaches at Gallipoli. Mr. Swinnerton offered to help, his monocle glinting with what might have been concern or satisfaction. Miss Marple gathered her wool, tucked her needles into the ball, and stood. Snowflakes began to fall, soft as communion wafers. She brushed one from her sleeve and smiled the small, satisfied smile of a knitter who has spotted a dropped stitch 3 rows back. "Come along," she murmured to no one in particular. "There's a cup of tea waiting at the vicarage, and a great deal to think about." Chapter 2. The suspects assemble. The church hall of St. Mary Mead smelled of damp hymnals, beeswax polish, and the faint, comforting sweetness of mince pies cooling on a trestle table. Gas lamps hissed along the walls, throwing circles of gold onto oak beams blackened by centuries of candle smoke. It was 20 minutes after the ruby's disappearance, and the village had retreated here like birds to a dovecote. The search party, Colonel Bantry at its head, had tramped the green, poked into hedges, and peered under the tombola stall. They had found nothing but a lost mitten and a half-eaten toffee apple. Now the suspects, the witnesses, and the merely curious were assembled under one roof. Miss Marple sat in the corner nearest the harmonium, her knitting bag on her lap, her mild blue eyes cataloging every face with the patience of a botanist labeling specimens. "Let us join her, shall we? The tea is strong, the gossip stronger, and the truth, somewhere in this room, is waiting to be unpicked, stitch by careful stitch." The hall's double doors banged open, admitting a gust of snow and Colonel Arthur Bantry, cheeks scarlet from cold and indignation. His regimental greatcoat was unbuttoned, revealing a waistcoat strained over a belly that had seen too many regimental dinners. Snowflakes melted on his mustache like tiny white flags of surrender. "Nobody leaves," he bellowed as though addressing a platoon. "Not until the ruby is found." His wife, Dolly Bantry, fluttered behind him like a worried hen. She wore a feathered hat that had once been fashionable in 1934 and a worried expression that was timeless. "Arthur, dear, you'll give Mrs. Price the vapors, and the children are freezing." Mrs. Price was already reclining on the front pew, a brandy glass trembling in her gloved hand. The mink stole had slipped to reveal a necklace of pearls the size of hazelnuts. £5,000, she moaned to anyone who would listen. "I offered 5,000 for that stone. It should be in a museum, not dangling on a tree like some vulgar fairground prize." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, click, 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 but her ears were tuned to every tremor in Mrs. Price's voice. Envy, she noted, had a pitch all its own. Near the mince pie table, Mr. Reginald Swinnerton was helping himself to a second slice. His bottle green suit was immaculate despite the snow. His monocle winked each time he turned his head. He cut the pie with surgical precision, then licked a crumb from his thumb with the delicacy of a cat. "A most unfortunate occurrence," he murmured to the vicar's wife, "though I must say the distraction was masterfully timed. One might almost admire the artistry." The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, looked shocked. "Artistry? Mr. Swinnerton, a priceless heirloom is missing." "Indeed, indeed." He dabbed his lips with a silk handkerchief. "But consider. 200 witnesses, floodlights, a choir, a puppet show, yet the gem vanishes in 3 seconds. That, my dear lady, is genius." Miss Marple's left eyebrow rose a fraction. Genius, she thought, or rehearsal. At the far end of the hall, the choir boys were being plied with cocoa by Miss Evelyn Hart. The librarian's parchment-colored coat was buttoned to the throat. Her bun was escaping its pins in wisps of iron gray. She moved among the boys with a clipboard, ticking names as though taking attendance at a funeral. Tom Fletcher stood slightly apart, cocoa untouched, his cassock buttonless where the loose one had fallen earlier. His eyes, dark, liquid, and far too old for a 12-year-old, kept flicking toward the puppet theater, now dismantled and leaning against the wall like a collapsed marionette. Miss Marple followed his gaze. The theater's velvet curtains were folded neatly, but one corner had snagged on a nail. A thread of crimson, identical to the missing circlet's lining, dangled like a drop of blood. The postmistress, Miss Weatherby, bustled in with a tray of cups. She was a woman who believed that any crisis could be solved with tea and the judicious spreading of information. "I've just heard from Mrs. Polk at the shop," she announced to the room at large. "The ruby's insured for 10,000, not 5, and the policy was taken out only last month by the parish council." A ripple of surprise ran through the hall. Mrs. Price sat up straighter. 10,000? Then why ever did they refuse my offer? Colonel Bantry snorted. "Because it's not about money, madam, it's about tradition." Miss Marple's needles paused. Tradition, she reflected, was a powerful motive. But so was desperation. Dolly Bantry appeared at her elbow, smelling of lavender water and anxiety. "Jane, dear, you must come and sit with us. Arthur's in a state. He's convinced it's an inside job." Miss Marple allowed herself to be led to a row of chairs near the fire. The colonel was already there, pacing in small, agitated circles. "Mark my words," he growled. "Someone knew exactly when the lights would come on. That generator's been temperamental all week. Polk had to kick it twice yesterday." "Arthur, do stop stomping," Dolly pleaded. "You'll wear a hole in the flagstones." Miss Marple settled her knitting on her lap. "Tell me, Colonel, who knew the exact timing of the lighting?" The colonel stopped mid-stride. "Well, the verger, of course, and Miss Hart. She timed the carols. And young Fletcher was standing right beside the switch." Tom Fletcher, overhearing, spilled cocoa down his cassock. "I never touched the switch, sir. I was singing." Miss Hart swooped down like a protective crow. "Tom was beside the switch, Colonel, not at it. And he's only 12. "Old enough to be bribed," the colonel muttered. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Or frightened. Children are easily frightened, Colonel, especially when debts are involved." The colonel flushed to the roots of his hair. Dolly gasped. "Jane, you don't mean—" "I mean nothing, dear. Only that debts have a way of pressing on a man. Like snow on a roof, perfectly manageable until the thaw." The colonel opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I owe a trifling sum at the club, that's all. £200. Hardly a motive for grand larceny." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Of course not. Though I did notice your ledger on the hall table earlier, open to a rather alarming page of red ink." Dolly's hand flew to her throat. "Arthur, you promised you'd settle that before Christmas." The colonel looked as though he'd been poleaxed. "Dash it all, woman, this is neither the time nor—" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Click, click. She had planted her seed. Across the room, Mr. Swinnerton was examining the puppet theater with professional interest. He lifted Punch's head, peered inside, then replaced it with a thoughtful frown. "Hollow," he murmured. "Room for confetti, perhaps, or something smaller." Tom Fletcher went white as the cocoa in his cup. Mrs. Price, revived by brandy and indignation, swept over to the dismantled stage. "If that ruby is inside one of those dreadful dolls, I shall sue the parish council for criminal negligence." Mr. Swinnerton bowed. "Madam, I assure you my puppets are innocent." though I did notice young Master Fletcher handling a velvet pouch during the performance. Red, as I recall. "For the confetti cannon," he said. Tom's cup clattered to the floor. Cocoa splashed across the flagstones like brown blood. Miss Hart knelt instantly, dabbing with her handkerchief. "Tom, dear, are you all right?" I dropped it," the boy stammered. "The pouch, during the show, it fell behind the curtain." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Behind the curtain or into Judy's skirt?" The vicar clapped his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, the police have been telephoned. Inspector Craddock will arrive within the hour. Until then, I suggest we all remain calm and—" "Calm!" Mrs. Price shrieked. "My nerves are shattered. I need my smelling salts." Dolly Bantry produced a small bottle from her handbag. The sharp scent of ammonia cut through the mince pie sweetness. Mrs. Price inhaled dramatically and subsided. Miss Marple rose. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I'll take a turn around the hall. Fresh air, you know." She moved with the apparent aimlessness of an elderly lady stretching her legs, but her path took her past the puppet theater. She paused to adjust her scarf, letting her gloved fingers brush the torn curtain. The crimson thread came away easily. She tucked it into her pocket with the same motion she might use to pocket a sweet. Near the harmonium, the choir boys were whispering. Tom Fletcher's voice rose in a frantic hiss. "I told you, I dropped it. I never meant—" Miss Hart shushed him. "Hush, Tom. We'll speak later." Miss Marple noted the way Miss Hart's hand trembled as she straightened the boy's collar. Fear, she thought, or guilt. The postmistress sidled up, eyes bright with news. "Miss Marple, have you heard? Old Mr. Badger at the bank says the ruby was appraised last week by a London expert. Guess who recommended him?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Mr. Swinnerton, perhaps." Miss Weatherby's nod was triumphant. "Exactly. And the expert's report said the stone was worth 12,000 now. Inflation, you know." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on. £12,000, enough to buy a small estate, or pay a gambling debt, or fund a museum wing. Chapter 3. The puppet's secret morning in St. Mary Mead arrived wrapped in cotton wool. Snow had fallen all night, soft, deliberate, erasing footprints with the impartiality of a parish clerk striking names from the baptismal roll. The village green lay virgin white, save for the dark scar where the Christmas tree stood, its colored bulbs dulled to opals under frost. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not the sort of woman to be daunted by a little weather. She had risen at 7, drunk 2 cups of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, and eaten a slice of toast with the marmalade she had put up herself in 1946. Still perfect, she noted with satisfaction. By 8:15, she was dressed in her second-best coat, the moss-green one being at the cleaners after last night's cocoa incident, a felt hat with a modest pheasant feather, and boots sturdy enough for a polar expedition. In her pocket, the crimson thread from the puppet curtain, a small magnifying glass that had once belonged to her nephew Raymond, and a packet of peppermints for emergencies. She was going visiting, and in St. Mary Mead visiting was rarely idle. Miss Marple's first port of call was the church hall. The doors were unlocked. Reverend Clement believed in the sanctity of open houses, even when priceless rubies were missing. Inside, the air still carried the ghost of last night's mince pies and the sharper tang of anxiety. The trestle tables had been stacked, the tombola prizes boxed away. Only the puppet theater remained, leaning against the wall like a drunk at closing time. She closed the door softly behind her. Snowlight filtered through the high windows, turning dust motes into slow-motion confetti. Click, click. She did not knit now. Her hands were occupied with observation. But the rhythm lived in her head. The theater was smaller than it had appeared under lantern light, a collapsible wooden frame draped in faded crimson velvet. The proscenium arch was painted with gilt scrolls. The curtains, though torn, were of good quality. Certainly not the cheap cotton one might expect for a children's show. Mr. Swinnerton, she reflected, did not travel with shoddy props. She knelt, carefully because knees at 70-odd were not to be trifled with, and examined the snag where the curtain had caught. The tear was fresh, the raw edges still crisp. The crimson thread in her pocket matched exactly. She laid it alongside. Identical weave, identical dye lot. Not a coincidence, she murmured. Next, the puppets. Punch lay on his side, red cheeks garish in the cold light. His hump was stuffed with sawdust. His stick had a real brass ferrule. Judy was more interesting. Her skirt, layers of net and cotton, had been mended recently. The stitches were neat but hurried, the thread a shade lighter than the original. Miss Marple lifted the skirt with the delicacy of a surgeon. Beneath the petticoats, a small flat pocket sewn inside the lining. Empty now, but the stitching was new, and the fabric around it faintly stained with something sticky, resin perhaps, or sugar from a child's fingers. She turned to Punch's head. It unscrewed with a soft pop, revealing a hollow cavity packed with sawdust and tucked at the bottom a scrap of red velvet no larger than a postage stamp. It was lined with the same material as the ruby's circlet, and on the inside, a faint, greasy smudge. Miss Marple touched it with a gloved finger, then sniffed. Pine resin, the sort jewelers use to grip stones without scratching them. A temporary hiding place, she thought. Clever, but not clever enough. Footsteps in the porch. She replaced the head, stood, and was innocently studying a hymn board when Tom Fletcher slipped inside, cheeks pink from cold and nerves. He carried a broom twice his height. "Morning, Miss Marple," he mumbled, eyes on the floorboards. "Good morning, Tom. Sweeping up for the vicar?" He nodded. "Mr. Pauk said the hall's a disgrace, cocoa everywhere." He began sweeping with unnecessary vigor, raising tiny clouds of dust. Miss Marple watched him for a moment. "You were very close to the puppet stage last night, weren't you?" Tom's broom faltered. I was singing, miss, with the choir." "Of course, but Mr. Swinnerton gave you something, didn't he?" "A pouch?" The boy went white. "It was only confetti for the cannon." Miss Marple's voice was gentle as thistledown. "Confetti is usually paper, Tom, not velvet, and not heavy enough to clunk when it falls." Tom's lower lip trembled. "I dropped it behind the curtain. I told Miss Hart." "And Miss Hart retrieved it?" He nodded miserably. "She said she'd put it back. But then the lights came on and everyone was shouting." Miss Marple patted the pew beside her. "Sit down, dear. You're swaying like a sapling in a gale." Tom obeyed, clutching the broom like a rifle. "Dad's in trouble, miss, with the bookies in London. Mr. Swinnerton said if I helped just a little, he'd pay the debt. £500. Dad said it was only a loan, but—" His voice cracked. "I didn't know it was the ruby." Miss Marple handed him a peppermint. He took it automatically. "Tell me exactly what Mr. Swinnerton asked you to do." Tom sucked the sweet, gathering courage. "During the puppet show, when Punch hit Judy, thwack, I was to swap the real pouch for a fake one filled with red glass beads. The fake was in my pocket, but my hands were shaking and the real one slipped. It fell into Judy's skirt. I heard it land, clunk. Then the lights came on and Mrs. Price screamed." Miss Marple nodded. "And Miss Hart was fixing the curtain at that moment?" "She's always fixing things," Tom said bitterly. "Says the village is falling apart without proper care." Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Tom. You've been very brave. Now run along and finish your sweeping. And remember, honesty is like knitting. One dropped stitch can be picked up, but a lie unravels the whole." Miss Marple's next stop was the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, flour on her apron and worry in her eyes, was rolling pastry for sausage rolls. "Inspector Craddock telephoned," she said. "The snow's delayed him. He'll be here by noon." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and a slice of seed cake. "Has anyone examined the tree itself?" "The verger climbed it at dawn. Nothing but pine needles and a robin's nest." Miss Marple sipped. Curious. A thief bold enough to steal in front of 200 people, yet cautious enough to leave no trace. Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. "The colonel's in a dreadful state. Dolly says he was up all night with his army revolver guarding the safe." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The safe where the ruby is not." By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was at the library, a converted stable behind Miss Hart's cottage. The air smelled of vellum, coal dust, and the particular mustiness of books that have been loved too much. Miss Hart was cataloging returns, her bun tighter than ever. "Miss Marple, what brings you out in this weather?" "Curiosity, my dear." "And a desire to return this?" Miss Marple produced a volume of the History of St. Mary Mead she had borrowed in 1945. "I believe I'm rather overdue." Miss Hart waved away the apology. "In times like these, fines are the least of our worries." She led Miss Marple to a table piled with maps. "I've been researching the ruby's provenance. Did you know it was hidden in the yew tree during the Civil War? There's a hollow just above the first branch." "Fascinating," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Tell me, Evelyn, were you near the puppet stage when the lights came on?" Miss Hart's hand fluttered to her throat. I was adjusting the curtain. It kept catching." "And you found something? A pouch, perhaps?" Miss Hart's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Yes, a red velvet pouch. I thought it was part of the show. I meant to return it to Mr. Swinnerton, but then the commotion—" She opened a drawer and produced the pouch. It was empty, the drawstring knotted tightly. Miss Marple turned it over. The velvet was identical to the circlet, the lining stained with resin. "May I borrow this? For comparison." Miss Hart hesitated, then nodded. "If it helps—" At 11:30, Miss Marple was back on the green. The snow had stopped. The sky was the color of a pigeon's breast. Children were building a snowman near the yew tree, their laughter bright as bells. She watched them for a moment, then approached the Christmas tree. The circlet was still in place, though the police had draped it with tape marked crime scene. Miss Marple studied the branches. At shoulder height, a small twig had been snapped, cleanly, deliberately. She reached into her pocket and drew out the crimson thread. It matched the broken needles perfectly. She was turning away when a voice called, "Miss Marple, a word?" Mr. Reginald Swinnerton strode across the snow, his Bentley parked ostentatiously by the lich gate. His cheeks were ruddy, his smile too wide. "I hear you've been sleuthing," he said jovially. "Amateur detection, charming hobby." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Merely tidying loose ends, Mr. Swinnerton, like darning socks." He laughed. "Well, if you find my missing confetti pouch, do let me know. The show must go on, ruby or no ruby." Miss Marple studied his gloves. The right one was pristine, the left had a faint brownish stain near the thumb. Pine resin dried to a tacky sheen. Chapter 4. The Widow's Envy. Today the house wore its Christmas best. Holly garlands on the banisters, a tree in the hall so tall its star scraped the chandelier, and a silver tray of sherry glasses waiting like soldiers on parade. Miss Jane Marple had been invited to a little tea at 4 o'clock. In St. Mary Mead, a little tea meant cucumber sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, 2 kinds of cake, and gossip served piping hot. Miss Marple arrived at 3:57 because punctuality was a virtue and curiosity a compulsion. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, ostensibly a jar of her famous damson jam, actually a pretext for questions. Let us follow her through the looking-glass of wealth, where envy glitters brighter than any ruby. The butler, Graves, an elderly retainer who had once served the Prince of Wales, took Miss Marple's coat with the reverence due to a duchess. He led her past a suit of armor that had never seen battle and into the drawing room, where a log fire roared with the enthusiasm of a dragon. Mrs. Price reclined on a chaise longue upholstered in peach silk. She wore a tea-gown of lavender chiffon that would have looked frivolous on a younger woman and merely eccentric on her 65 years. A triple string of pearls glowed against her collarbone. A diamond spray shaped like mistletoe winked at her shoulder. Her face, powdered, rouged, and carefully arranged, was a masterpiece of polite outrage. "Miss Marple, how good of you to brave the snow. Do sit by the fire. Your cheeks are quite blue." Miss Marple obeyed, arranging her skirt with care. "The walk was bracing, Clarissa, and your invitation irresistible." Mrs. Price rang a silver bell. A maid appeared with a tray. Wafer-thin sandwiches, scones still steaming, a Victoria sponge crowned with crystallized violets. The tea was lapsang souchong, smoky, aristocratic, and far too exotic for wartime memories. While Mrs. Price poured, Miss Marple's eyes traveled the room. Every surface glittered. Sèvres porcelain, Fabergé eggs, a vitrine of jeweled snuff boxes. But the central display case, directly opposite the chaise, was empty save for a velvet cushion shaped like a crown. A brass plaque read, "Reserved for the St. Nicholas ruby." Mrs. Price followed her gaze. "Ghastly, isn't it? Like a tooth missing from a smile. I offered 5,000, you know. 5. And those parsimonious counselors refused. Said it belonged to the village." She sniffed. "As if the village could appreciate a stone of that quality." Miss Marple accepted a sandwich. "You are a collector, Clarissa. One understands the passion." "Passion?" Mrs. Price's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "My late husbands, God rest them, indulged me. Reginald I bought me sapphires in Cairo. Clarence II emeralds in Cape Town. But rubies—" She sighed theatrically. "Clarence promised me a pigeon's blood ruby for our silver anniversary. Then he dropped dead on the golf course. Heart attack. The stone was never purchased." Her fingers worried the pearls. The St. Nicholas ruby would have been perfect compensation. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Compensation is a curious word for a gift." Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed. "One must seize opportunities, Miss Marple, especially when one is alone." The maid returned with a fresh pot. Miss Marple noted the girl's hands, rough red, trembling slightly as she set down the silver strainer. Nerves, she thought. Or guilt. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, "were you near the tree when the lights came on?" Mrs. Price waved a languid hand. "Heavens, no! I was by the mulled wine stall, charming the vicar into a second cup. Though I did notice that dreadful puppet man, Swinnerton, fiddling with something just before the scream." Miss Marple filed the observation away. "And your display case, such a prominent position. One might almost think you expected the ruby to be here by now." Mrs. Price flushed beneath her powder. "I am a woman of foresight, Miss Marple. The parish council would have seen sense eventually." The door opened again. Colonel Bantry stomped in, snow on his boots and fury in his eyes. Dolly trailed behind, clutching a fur muff like a shield. "Clarissa, dash it all!" the colonel barked. "Dolly says you've been spreading tales about my debts." Mrs. Price raised an eyebrow. "My dear Arthur, the village talks. One cannot help what one overhears in the post office queue." Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag as naturally as breathing, began their soft click-click. She watched the colonel's mustache quiver like a live thing. £200, he spluttered. A trifling sum. I've settled larger wagers on a single horse. Dolly's voice was a nervous chirp. But Arthur, the bookie's letter, said, "Never mind the letter." He rounded on Mrs. Price. "And you, madam, with your museum nonsense. The ruby stays in St. Mary Mead where it belongs." Mrs. Price smiled sweetly. "Until someone steals it, apparently." The atmosphere crackled. Miss Marple buttered a scone with serene precision. "Debts and desires," she murmured. "Such uncomfortable bedfellows." The colonel subsided into a chair, accepting a whiskey instead of tea. Dolly fluttered to Mrs. Price's side. "Clarissa, you must show Miss Marple your new acquisition, the Fabergé egg." Mrs. Price brightened. "Of course, though it's nothing compared to what might have been." She led the way to a side table where a crimson egg rested on a gold stand. It opened to reveal a miniature ruby-crowned crown. "A consolation prize," she said bitterly. Miss Marple examined it through her magnifying glass. "Exquisite workmanship, though the rubies are glass, I think." Mrs. Price stiffened. "Paste, yes, but one must make do." The colonel snorted. "Paste, like your pretensions, Clarissa." Dolly gasped. Mrs. Price's smile froze. For a moment the drawing room seemed poised on the edge of a duel. Miss Marple closed the egg with a soft click. "Paste can be convincing, Colonel, especially under bright lights, like the ones on the Christmas tree." Silence fell, broken only by the grandfather clock striking the quarter. Chapter 5. The Librarian's Legend. The snow had stopped by dawn, leaving St. Mary Mead wrapped in a hush so complete that even the rooks seemed to speak in whispers. The village green lay under a blanket of white, the Christmas tree a dark exclamation mark against the sky. The ancient yew at its heart, gnarled, eternal, and rumored to be older than the church itself, stood sentinel, its branches heavy with frost. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not a woman to be deterred by silence or cold. She had risen early, fortified by tea and toast, and by 9 o'clock was trudging through the snow with the determination of a terrier on a scent. Her destination, the cottage of Miss Evelyn Hart, librarian, historian, and keeper of St. Mary Mead's secrets. In her pocket, the crimson thread, the empty velvet pouch, and a small tin of peppermints. In her mind, a pattern almost complete but missing one crucial stitch. Let us follow her into the labyrinth of legend, where history and human nature intertwine like ivy on old stone. Miss Hart's cottage crouched at the end of a lane so narrow it was more suggestion than thoroughfare. It was a low, timber-framed building with a thatched roof that sagged like an old man's eyebrows. Ivy clung to the walls. A brass knocker shaped like a quill gleamed on the door. Miss Marple knocked thrice, firm, polite, unmistakable. The door opened a crack. Miss Hart peered out, her bun tighter than ever, her eyes sharp behind steel-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Marple, at this hour, the roads are barely passable." "Good morning, Evelyn. I've brought you a jar of damson jam, last year's, but it keeps beautifully. May I come in?" "My toes are quite numb." Miss Hart hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course. Though I warn you, the place is a disgrace, books everywhere." The cottage was indeed a shrine to the written word. Shelves groaned under leather-bound tomes, yellowed maps, and folios tied with faded ribbon. A fire burned low in the grate. A kettle simmered on the hob. The air smelled of vellum, coal dust, and the particular mustiness of knowledge hoarded too long. Miss Marple removed her boots, arranged them neatly by the door, and accepted a seat on a chintz sofa that had seen better decades. Miss Hart fussed with cups, mismatched but fine bone china, and poured tea strong enough to wake the dead. "You're here about the ruby," Miss Hart said, handing over a cup. It was not a question. Miss Marple sipped. "Naturally, the village is in an uproar. Inspector Craddock is baffled. I thought you might have insights. Miss Hart's lips thinned. I've spent my life studying that stone. Its history is the village's history. Did you know it was hidden in the yew tree during the Civil War? There's a hollow just above the first branch. Parliamentarian soldiers searched for it, but the vicar's wife sewed it into her petticoat. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A clever woman, petticoats are excellent hiding places. Miss Hart missed the irony. She rose and crossed to a table piled with maps. Look here. She unrolled a parchment yellowed and cracked, showing the village green in 1644. The yew was marked with a tiny cross. The hollow is still there. I checked last summer. Deep enough for a ruby or a pouch. Miss Marple leaned closer. The map was beautifully drawn. The ink faded to sepia. And you believe the thief might have used it? Miss Hart's voice dropped to a whisper. It's the perfect hiding place. No one would think to look in the tree itself. The police searched the ground, the hedges, the church safe, but not the yew. Miss Marple noted the tremor in Miss Hart's hand as she rolled the map. Excitement, she thought, or fear? Tell me, Evelyn, she said, were you near the tree after the lights came on? Miss Hart busied herself with the teapot. I was everywhere, Miss Marple, directing the choir, fixing the puppet curtain, calming the children. Chaos. Absolute chaos. Miss Marple produced the velvet pouch from her pocket and laid it on the table. You gave me this yesterday. You said you found it behind the curtain. Miss Hart froze. Yes, I thought it was part of the show. It's empty now, Miss Marple said gently. But it wasn't when you found it, was it? Miss Hart's cup rattled in its saucer. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple turned the pouch inside out. The star-shaped imprint gleamed faintly in the firelight. This is the mark of the St. Nicholas ruby, and here, she pointed to a tiny stitch. You sewed something into Judy's skirt, didn't you? To protect it. Miss Hart sank into a chair. I only wanted to save it. The ruby belongs to the village, not to some London dealer or that dreadful Price woman. I thought if I hid it in the yew, I could discover it later. Say the pirate's ghost returned it. The legend would live on. Miss Marple's voice was soft as snowfall. And Tom Fletcher's pouch? You took it when he dropped it? Miss Hart nodded miserably. He was terrified. I told him I'd handle it. I meant to return the ruby to the circlet, but then Mrs. Price screamed and I panicked. I sewed it into Judy's skirt. I was going to retrieve it after the police left. Miss Marple patted her hand. Panic is a poor advisor, Evelyn, but honesty is a good one. Where is the ruby now? Miss Hart's eyes filled with tears. I moved it last night, to the yew. The hollow is exactly as the map shows. I wrapped it in oilskin to protect it from damp. Miss Marple stood. Then we must retrieve it before Inspector Craddock thinks to look there, and before someone else does. The two women ventured into the snow, Miss Hart clutching a lantern, Miss Marple her umbrella like a sword. The village green was deserted. The Christmas tree lights had been turned off, leaving it a dark silhouette. The yew loomed, its branches heavy with frost. Miss Hart led the way to the trunk. Here, she whispered, pointing to a knot in the bark. She reached into the hollow, her arm disappearing to the elbow, and drew out a small oilskin bundle. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers. The St. Nicholas ruby gleamed, blood-red and perfect, the star inclusion winking like a secret. Miss Marple exhaled. Safe, for now. Miss Hart clutched it to her chest. What happens now? Now, Miss Marple said, we return it to the vicar. And you tell the truth. The village will forgive a guardian, Evelyn. It's harder to forgive a thief. Back in the cottage, Miss Hart poured fresh tea while Miss Marple examined the ruby under her magnifying glass. Flawless, she murmured. Though I wonder, Mr. Swinnerton appraised it recently, didn't he? Miss Hart nodded. He recommended the London expert, said the value had risen to 12,000. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Curious. A dealer who knows the exact value arranges the appraisal and brings a puppet show to distract the village, and Tom Fletcher's father owes £500. Miss Hart gasped. You think Swinnerton planned the theft? I think, Miss Marple said, he planned a substitution. The pouch Tom dropped contained a paste ruby, convincing under lights but worthless. Swinnerton would swap the real gem during the confusion, then find the fake later, claiming the thief took a copy. The insurance would pay and he'd sell the real stone abroad. Miss Hart's face crumpled. And I nearly helped him by hiding it. Miss Marple folded the ruby back into its oilskin. Unwittingly, my dear. But now we know where it's been. The question is, where is Swinnerton? At noon, Miss Marple returned to the green. Children were sledging down the slope near the church. Their laughter rang like bells. She watched them for a moment, then approached the Christmas tree. The police tape had been removed. The circlet was back in place, empty and forlorn. She studied the snapped twig again. It was at shoulder height for a tall man or a woman in sensible boots. She reached up and felt inside the branches. Her fingers brushed something hard, a small glass bead, red, faceted like a ruby. The paste copy, she thought, dropped in the swap. She pocketed it and turned to find Mr. Reginald Swinnerton watching from the lich gate, his Bentley idling behind him. Miss Marple, he called, striding over. Any progress? The village is quite desolate without its bauble. Miss Marple smiled serenely. Progress, yes. The ruby is safe, though I wonder, did you bring a spare for your puppet show? Confetti is so untidy. Swinnerton's monocle glinted. I've no idea what you mean. Of course not. Miss Marple held up the glass bead. Paste, very convincing, especially at a distance. Swinnerton's smile faltered. A trinket for the children. Miss Marple tucked the bead away. Children drop things, Mr. Swinnerton, so do thieves in a hurry. He bowed stiffly and retreated to his car. The engine roared to life, scattering snow. Chapter 6. The Dealer's Double. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not a woman to let a motor car outrun curiosity. She had followed the Bentley's tracks through the snow, arriving at the inn just as the church clock struck 2. In her pocket, the paste ruby bead, the oilskin-wrapped St. Nicholas ruby, entrusted to her by Miss Hart, and a letter from Inspector Craddock confirming the train timetable. Let us climb the creaking stairs with her, dear listener, and see what the dealer is hiding behind his polished smile. The inn's landlady, Mrs. Bessler, a woman built like a shire horse and twice as strong, met Miss Marple in the hall. He's upstairs, miss. Paid his bill in crisp fivers and asked for a packed lunch. Said he's catching the 3:15 to London. Miss Marple nodded. Might I trouble you for a cup of tea in the parlor, and perhaps a word with Mr. Swinnerton when he descends? Mrs. Bessler's eyes gleamed. I'll send him down, though he's in a rare hurry. Miss Marple settled in the parlor, a snug room with horse brasses on the walls and a fire that smelled of apple wood. She opened her knitting bag, produced the scarf for the district nurse, and began to knit with deceptive calm. Click, 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 click. Each stitch was a heartbeat in the countdown to departure. At 2:17, Swinnerton appeared, coat buttoned, hat in hand. His monocle flashed as he spotted her. Miss Marple, still sleuthing, I see. Miss Marple smiled serenely. Merely waiting for tea, Mr. Swinnerton. Though I confess I have a small matter to discuss. Might you join me? He hesitated, glancing at the clock above the bar. I've a train. It will only take 5 minutes, and the 3:15 is often late in snow. Swinnerton sat, folding his gloves with care. The right glove was pristine. The left still bore the faint resin stain. Mrs. Bessler brought tea, 2 cups, a plate of shortbread, and retreated with the discretion of a woman who knows when to listen at keyholes. Miss Marple poured. "You leave us so soon?" "Business in town," Swinnerton said smoothly. "The ruby's disappearance has quite ruined my little show. Children are fickle." Miss Marple handed him a cup. "Children, yes, though I believe young Tom Fletcher was more useful than fickle. He told me about the pouch swap." Swinnerton's hand paused mid-air. "Pouch swap? A game, nothing more." Miss Marple produced the paste ruby bead and laid it on the table. It caught the firelight, glowing like a drop of blood. "A game with glass beads. Very convincing under colored bulbs. You intended to substitute this for the real ruby, then discover the fake later. The insurance would pay $12,000, and you'd sell the genuine stone abroad." Swinnerton's smile thinned. "A fanciful theory, Miss Marple. I'm an antique dealer, not a conjurer." "Dealers know value," Miss Marple said. "You arranged the appraisal, you brought the puppet show, you bribed Tom to create the distraction. But Miss Hart interfered. She hid the real ruby in the yew tree, thinking to protect it. You were left with the paste." Swinnerton set down his cup. "And where, pray, is this real ruby now?" Miss Marple patted her bag. "Safe, with me." For the first time, Swinnerton's composure cracked. "You're bluffing." Miss Marple opened her bag and drew out the oilskin bundle. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing the St. Nicholas ruby. The star inclusion winked like a conspirator. Swinnerton's eyes widened. His monocle slipped and dangled on its ribbon. "Impossible," he whispered. "It was in the tree." "It was," Miss Marple said. "Miss Hart retrieved it last night. She confessed everything. The police are on their way." Swinnerton lunged for the ruby. Miss Marple was faster. She swept it into her bag and stood, umbrella raised like a rapier. "I wouldn't, Mr. Swinnerton. Mrs. Bessler is a champion shot with a rolling pin." The door burst open. Inspector Craddock strode in, flanked by 2 constables. "Reginald Swinnerton, I arrest you for theft and conspiracy." Swinnerton bolted. He shoved Craddock aside and sprinted for the stairs. Miss Marple's umbrella hooked his ankle. He sprawled, monocle flying. The constables pounced. As he was handcuffed, Swinnerton glared at Miss Marple. "How did you know?" Miss Marple adjusted her hat. "Human nature, Mr. Swinnerton. You polished your left glove 3 times yesterday, resin from the real ruby. Your right glove was new, covering the stain from the paste. And your train ticket." She produced it from her pocket. "Dover, not London. You plan to flee with the stone tonight." Craddock took the ticket, eyebrows raised. "Where did you—" "Mrs. Bessler found it in the wastepaper basket," Miss Marple said demurely. "She's very thorough." Chapter 7. The Colonel's Ledger. Yet one loose thread remained in Miss Jane Marple's knitting. The Colonel's Ledger. Its red ink, its dramatic deadline had been too neat, too convenient. This afternoon the village green was alive with children reenacting the crime with dolls and shouts. Miss Marple watched from her usual bench, scarf nearly finished, peppermints in her pocket. Let us sit beside her, dear listener, and see how a child's game unmasks the last pretender. The children had built a snow stage near the yew tree. Little Sally Pauk, the verger's daughter, directed with imperial authority. She was 8, freckled, and possessed of a voice that could summon dogs from 3 fields away. "Tom is the thief," she declared, "and Judy is the ruby." A rag doll in a red skirt was propped on a crate. The boys took turns snatching it while the girls screamed. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Accurate, she thought, in its essentials. Sally spotted her. "Miss Marple, you're the detective. Come and solve it." Miss Marple rose with dignity. "Very well, Sergeant Pauk. What have we?" Sally pointed to the doll. The ruby's gone, but look. She lifted Judy's skirt. Sewn inside was a button, shiny and red. It's a clue! The button was brass, painted crimson. Miss Marple turned it over, engraved on the back. A.B. Gallipoli, 1915. Colonel Bantry's dress uniform button, she realized, from the night of the theft. Sally beamed. Tom dropped it when he was swapping pouches. Miss Marple patted her head. Excellent observation, Sergeant. Now where did you find it? In the puppet box. Daddy said the police missed it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The puppet box had been searched. Or had it? At 4 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at the Bantry cottage, Gossington Lodge, a rambling house with too many chimneys and a garden that defied rationing. Dolly Bantry greeted her with flour on her apron and relief in her eyes. Jane, thank heaven. Arthur's in the study tearing his hair over that wretched ledger. The bank telephoned, his debt is paid. Miss Marple removed her boots. Paid? By whom? Dolly lowered her voice. Anonymous donor. £500 in an envelope marked for the Colonel's honor. Posted yesterday. Miss Marple's umbrella tapped the floor. Curious timing. The study door was ajar. Colonel Bantry sat at his desk, ledger open, a fountain pen idle beside it. His mustache drooped like a weary flag. Miss Marple, he barked, then softened. Dash it, sit down. I owe you an apology. Miss Marple settled into a leather chair. For the ledger, Colonel? He flushed. You saw through it, eh? Red ink, threats, the whole bally show. I forged the entries myself. Dolly gasped from the doorway. Arthur! The Colonel waved her silent. Had to, old girl. Swinnerton was sniffing around the ruby for weeks. Appraisal, puppet show, bribing young Fletcher. I knew he'd strike at the lighting. Needed a reason to watch him like a hawk. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. So you invented a debt to justify your vigilance. Exactly. The Colonel thumped the desk. 200 at the club, 500 to the bookie, pure fiction. I even wrote the bookie's letter myself. Wanted Swinnerton to think I was desperate enough to help him. Keep your enemies close, what? Dolly wrung her hands. But the button, Arthur? In the puppet box, the Colonel chuckled. Planted it myself. During the chaos, I slipped it into Judy's skirt. Thought if the police found it, they'd search the puppets properly. Missed it, the blighters. Miss Marple produced the painted button. Sally Polk found it. Children are thorough. The Colonel roared with laughter. By Jove, outdone by an 8-year-old. Miss Marple smiled. Your plan worked, Colonel. Swinnerton did approach you, offered to lend you the $500 if you looked the other way. The Colonel nodded. In the pub, 2 nights ago, I played along, then tipped off Craddock. But the snow delayed him, and you beat us both to it. Dolly poured tea, strong with a plate of shortbread. So the anonymous donor? Me, the Colonel said sheepishly. Used my regimental pension. Couldn't let the village think I was in done territory. Pride, you know. Miss Marple sipped. Pride is a sturdy motive, Colonel, and a kind one when it serves the village. At 5, Miss Marple walked to the police station. Inspector Craddock was buried in paperwork, Swinnerton's confession signed and sealed. Colonel Bantry's ledger was a decoy, she said. He forged it to bait Swinnerton. The button was his plant. Craddock leaned back. So the Colonel's clean? Spotless, though his pension is 500 lighter. Craddock whistled. A patriot and a pauper. I'll release the ledger entries as errors. Miss Marple handed over the painted button. And this, return it to the Colonel, with compliments from Sergeant Sally Polk. Evening found the village gathered in the church hall for the Christmas pageant rehearsal. The ruby, returned by police escort, gleamed once more in its circlet, under guard by the verger and 2 stout constables. Children sang once in Royal David City, Miss Hart directed with trembling hands. Tom Fletcher's voice cracked on the high notes but held. Miss Marple sat in the back, knitting the final rows of the scarf. Dolly Bantry slipped in beside her. "Arthur's writing a letter to the club," she whispered. "Confessing the forgery, says honor demands it." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Honor is like knitting, Dolly. One straight stitch after another." The colonel joined them, button gleaming on his lapel. "Miss Marple, the village owes you a statue." Miss Marple laughed softly. "A cup of tea will suffice." Chapter 8. The Revelation in the Vestry. The entire village had been summoned by handwritten notes delivered by the Boy Scouts. 7:30 p.m. Vestry. Miss Marple will explain the ruby. They came in coats and scarves, clutching mugs of cocoa, eyes bright with curiosity and relief. The St. Nicholas ruby, returned from the police vault, rested on a purple cushion atop the harmonium, guarded by Inspector Craddock and the verger's wife. Miss Jane Marple stood beside the ruby, small and unassuming, her knitting bag at her feet. The scarf for the district nurse was finished. Tonight she held only a single sheet of paper, her notes written in neat copperplate. Let us crowd into the vestry with them, dear listener, and watch the final stitches fall into place. Reverend Clement raised his hands for silence. Miss Marple has asked to speak. Let us listen with open hearts. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it carried to the rafters. "Thank you, Vicar, and thank you all for coming on such a cold night. The ruby is safe, Mr. Swinnerton is in custody, and St. Mary Mead may sleep easy. But a mystery is not solved until every thread is tied. Tonight, I shall tie them." She turned to the harmonium. The ruby caught the candlelight, its star inclusion winking like a secret. "Let us begin at the beginning. The theft occurred in 3 seconds, between the lights igniting and Mrs. Price's scream. 200 witnesses, yet no one saw the hand that lifted the gem. Why?" Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Distraction, dash it, the puppets." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. Mr. Swinnerton's Punch and Judy show was perfectly timed. Young Tom Fletcher was bribed to swap a velvet pouch containing a paste ruby for the real one. But Tom dropped the real pouch. It fell into Judy's skirt." Tom Fletcher, seated between his parents, went crimson. His mother squeezed his hand. "Miss Hart," Miss Marple continued, "was fixing the puppet curtain. She retrieved the pouch, intending to protect the ruby. She sewed it into Judy's skirt, then moved it to the yew tree's hollow, guided by this map." She held up the 1644 parchment. Miss Hart bowed her head. Mrs. Price sniffed. "A foolish woman. The stone belonged in a museum." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Patience, Clarissa. Mr. Swinnerton planned to substitute the paste ruby, claim the insurance, and sell the real stone abroad. His train ticket to Dover, hidden in Punch's head, confirmed his flight. But Miss Hart's actions foiled him. He was left with glass." Inspector Craddock held up the paste replica. "Found in his suitcase. Worthless." Miss Marple turned to the colonel. "And you, Arthur, forged your ledger to bait Swinnerton. You planted your Gallipoli button in Judy's skirt to force a thorough search. Your $500 debt was paid with your own pension, sent anonymously to preserve your honor." The colonel's mustache twitched with pride. Dolly Bantry dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple smiled. "A village of guardians. But one mystery remains. The ruby itself." She lifted the gem from its cushion. The room fell silent. "This stone has been St. Mary Mead's pride for nearly 3 centuries. Legend says Silas St. Nicholas, the repentant pirate, gifted it in 1672. But legends, like knitting, sometimes have dropped stitches." She held the ruby to the candle. Observed the star inclusion, perfectly centered, too perfect. In 1672, gem cutting was crude. A star this precise requires modern lasers, impossible before 1960. Gasps rippled through the vestry. Reverend Clement leaned forward. You mean, it's a forgery? Miss Marple shook her head. Not a forgery, a replacement. The original ruby was stolen in 1850 during the Great Exhibition. The vicar of the time, Reverend Josiah Clement. She nodded to the current vicar's ancestor in a portrait, commissioned a paste copy to avoid scandal. The real stone was never recovered. She turned the ruby over. On the base, faint engraving, J.C. 1851. The real ruby was flawed, a crack through the star. This one is flawless because it is glass filled with red resin to mimic weight. The star is a foil inclusion, exquisite work but not nature's. Mrs. Price shrieked. Glass! I offered $5,000 for glass? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You offered for a legend, Clarissa, and legends are priceless. Inspector Craddock examined the ruby under a magnifying glass. She's right. The crack is missing. And this engraving, Miss Marple continued. The parish council knew. The appraisal Swinnerton arranged was for insurance, $12,000 for a paste stone to fund church repairs. The vicar planned to lose it, claim the insurance, then find it again. A harmless deception to save the roof. Reverend Clement flushed. It was for the greater good. The village erupted in chatter. Miss Marple raised a hand. Swinnerton discovered the truth during his appraisal. He planned to steal the real ruby, believing the legend, then learned it was paste. He substituted an even poorer fake, hoping to sell the real one abroad before the truth emerged. Miss Hart's actions saved us from embarrassment. The colonel's ruse caught the thief, and Tom's honesty redeemed his father's debt. She placed the ruby back on its cushion. The stone is glass, but the legend is real. Let it stay on the tree, let the children believe. St. Mary Mead's heart is not in a gem, it is in its people. Silence fell, then applause. The colonel led a cheer. Miss Hart wept quietly. Tom Fletcher was hugged by 3 choir boys. Mrs. Price stood. I withdraw my offer. The ruby belongs here, glass or diamond. Miss Marple smiled. Spoken like a true villager, Clarissa. The meeting ended with cocoa and mince pies. Miss Marple slipped out to the churchyard. Snow crunched under her boots. The yew tree loomed dark and ancient. Inspector Craddock joined her. You knew about the paste ruby from the start? Miss Marple shook her head. I suspected when I saw the star, too perfect. My nephew Raymond has a similar stone from Burma. The engraving confirmed it. But I let the legend stand. Sometimes truth is less kind than fiction. Craddock chuckled. You're a soft touch, Miss Marple. She gazed at the tree. I'm a knitter, Inspector. I know when to drop a stitch and when to pick it up. Chapter 9. The Confrontation at Dawn. She had summoned 5 people to meet her at dawn. The vicar, the colonel, Mrs. Price, Miss Hart, and young Tom Fletcher. Inspector Craddock waited in the shadows, notebook ready. Tonight the legend would end, or begin anew. Let us stand in the frosty vestry with them, dear listener, and watch Miss Marple draw the final curtain. The vestry door creaked open at 5:27. Reverend Clement arrived first, muffler askew, eyes wide with worry. Miss Marple, this is most irregular. Miss Marple pressed a finger to her lips. Necessary, Vicar, please sit. Next came Colonel Bantry, ramrod straight despite the hour, Dolly hovering behind with a thermos of coffee. Mrs. Price swept in wearing sable and indignation. Miss Hart followed, clutching her map like a shield. Tom Fletcher slipped in last, cap in hand, his mother waiting outside with the verger. Miss Marple stood by the harmonium. The paste ruby rested on its purple cushion, candlelight dancing in its flawless star. Thank you for coming, she began. The ruby is safe. Mr. Swinnerton is in custody, but one truth remains unspoken. Tonight we face it together. She lifted the ruby. This stone is glass. It has been glass since 1851 when the original was stolen at the Great Exhibition. Reverend Josiah Clement replaced it with paste to spare the village shame. The insurance policy for $12,000 was to repair the church roof, not to enrich thieves. Reverend Clement gasped. How did you... Miss Marple held up the engraving rubbing. The base reads J.C. 1851. The star is foil, not diamond. The crack of the original is absent. I confirmed it with my nephew's Burma ruby, identical foil work. Mrs. Price's sable slipped. You mean I offered $5,000 for glass? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You offered for a legend, Clarissa, and legends have value beyond price. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled. Then Swinnerton's scheme was built on a lie, Miss Marple said. He believed the ruby real, planned to steal it, substitute paste, and flee. Miss Hart hid the glass stone in the yew, thinking to protect the legend. Tom dropped the real pouch, empty because Swinnerton had already palmed the glass ruby during the puppet show. Tom's eyes widened. So I never held the real one? Miss Marple smiled. Never, dear. Swinnerton swapped the glass ruby for his poorer paste during the thwack of Punch's stick. The pouch you dropped contained only air. Miss Hart clutched her map. Then my hiding it saved us from embarrassment, Miss Marple said. The police would have found glass either way. Your actions forced Swinnerton to flee with nothing. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. We've charged him with attempted theft and conspiracy. The paste replica in his suitcase seals it. Mrs. Price rounded on the vicar. You knew it was glass? Reverend Clement nodded miserably. The council voted to keep the secret. The roof leaks like a sieve. The insurance was fraud, Mrs. Price snapped. Miss Marple raised a hand. Was kindness. The village would pay the premium, the roof would be mended, the legend preserved. No one loses except the insurance company, which can afford it. Colonel Bantry chuckled. A soldier's ruse, I like it. Dolly Bantry poured coffee. But the children, will they know? Miss Marple unwrapped her parcel. Inside, a small velvet box. She opened it to reveal a tiny ruby chip, real, flawed, with a crack through the star. The original fragment, found in the church archives, hidden in Josiah Clement's diary. This is the true St. Nicholas ruby, what remains of it. Gasps echoed. Miss Marple placed the chip beside the paste stone. Let the paste stay on the tree, let the children believe. But let this fragment be locked in the safe, with the truth written beside it, for the next vicar, for the next crisis. Reverend Clement took the chip with trembling fingers. A compromise. The legend lives, the truth sleeps. Mrs. Price removed her diamond mistletoe brooch. Then I insist on donating this. For the roof, let the village have real jewels and real honesty. Miss Hart laid her map on the table. And I'll write the true history for the archives, no more secrets. Tom Fletcher stepped forward. I'll pay back the $500 from my paper round, every penny. His mother wept. The colonel clapped him on the shoulder. Stout lad. Miss Marple closed her notebook. Then it's settled. The ruby stays on the tree, the fragment in the safe, the insurance claim withdrawn, the roof mended by village subscription, led by Mrs. Price's diamonds. She turned to Craddock. And Swinnerton? Released at dawn, Craddock said. Charges dropped. He stole glass. Attempted theft of paste is hardly a crime. Miss Marple smiled. Let him go. He'll carry the shame and the story. London will laugh at the dealer who fled with a bauble. Chapter 10. Tea and Epilogue. The entire cast of our little drama had been invited. They came in coats and scarves, stamping snow from their boots, faces pink with cold and wonder. Let us pull up a chair by the fire, dear listener, and watch Miss Marple serve the final course, truth with sugar, resolution with cream. The first to arrive were Reverend and Mrs. Clement bearing a bottle of elderflower cordial and the brass plate for the safe. The vicar's sewer whiskers were trimmed for the occasion. His wife carried a tray of sausage rolls for the children. Miss Marple, the vicar boomed, the roof fund stands at $1,143 and rising. Mrs. Price's diamonds fetched $800. The WI added $200 from the raffle, and anonymous envelopes keep appearing in the collection plate. Miss Marple poured tea, strong with a slice of lemon for those who preferred it. Anonymous giving is the village's specialty, vicar. Like knitting, one quiet stitch at a time. Next came Colonel and Dolly Bantry, the colonel in his regimental tie, Dolly clutching a parcel wrapped in regimental ribbon. "For young Fletcher," she whispered, "a new bicycle. Paid from Arthur's pension properly this time." The colonel's mustache bristled with pride. "Debt of honor, dash it. The lad's earned it." Mrs. Clarissa Price swept in wearing a new mink hat and an expression of determined benevolence. She carried a velvet box. "My late husband's ruby tie pin, real this time. For the church safe. Let the paste stay on the tree. Let the village have something genuine to guard." Miss Marple accepted the box with a twinkle. "A wise compromise, Clarissa. Legends need a little truth to stand on." Miss Evelyn Hart arrived with a leather-bound volume, her completed true history of the St. Nicholas ruby. "For the archives," she said, shyly. "Every secret written, every guardian named. Including you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple turned the pages. Her name appeared in elegant script. "Jane Marple, observer of human nature, keeper of the pattern." Tom Fletcher slipped in last, cap in hand, eyes wide at the spread. His mother followed with a plate of homemade fudge. "Tom saved $350 from his paper round," she said. "First installment on the $500. The colonel clapped the boy on the shoulder. "Stout lad, we'll call it the Ruby Redemption Fund." The room filled, the verger and his wife, the postmistress with the latest gossip, the choir boys still in their cassocks, Inspector Craddock in plain clothes nursing a mug of tea. Even Mr. Swinnerton sent a telegram from his London club, regret inability to attend. Lesson learned. R.S. read aloud by the postmistress to general laughter. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, small and straight as a knitting needle. "Before we eat, a toast." She raised her cup. "To St. Mary Mead, to paste rubies and real hearts, to secrets shared and legends preserved, and to every one of you who guarded the village better than any gem." Cups clinked. The fire crackled. Outside, children began to sing under the tree. The feast began. Sandwiches disappeared. The Victoria sponge was pronounced better than Fortnum's. Miss Marple moved among her guests, refilling cups, accepting compliments with a modest nod. Dolly Bantry cornered her by the cake stand. "Jane, how did you know about the paste ruby from the start?" Miss Marple cut a slice of sponge. "The star, dear. Too perfect. Nature is rarely symmetrical, and the weight, glass with resin, is heavier than diamond. I felt it when I held it in the vestry." The colonel joined them, munching a sausage roll. "And my forged ledger? You saw through that in Chapter 2? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Red ink is dramatic, Colonel. Real debts are written in black, quiet like snow. And your Gallipoli button, too convenient. You planted it to force a search." Mrs. Price approached, tie-pin box in hand. "I was a fool, Miss Marple. Envy is a poor jewel." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Envy is human, Clarissa. You turned it to generosity. That's the rarest gem." Miss Hart offered her book. "Will you write the foreword?" Miss Marple considered. "One sentence. In St. Mary Mead, the greatest treasure is not what we guard, but who we become while guarding it." Tom Fletcher tugged her sleeve. "Miss Marple, will the ruby still be on the tree tonight?" Miss Marple knelt to his level. "Every Christmas, Tom. And every child will believe it's real, because in their hearts it is." At noon, the party spilled into the lane. The church bells rang for the Christmas service. The paste ruby gleamed on the tree. The real chip lay safe in the vault, its cracked star a secret between friends. Miss Marple stood on her doorstep watching the village, process to church, scarves bright, voices raised in carols. The colonel carried Tom on his shoulders. Mrs. Price linked arms with Miss Hart. Dolly Bantry waved the new bicycle like a banner. Inspector Craddock paused. "You've given them more than a ruby, Miss Marple. You've given them each other." Miss Marple smiled. "That's the true magic, Inspector, like knitting. One loop connects to the next, and suddenly you have a scarf." In her cottage, Miss Marple cleared the table with quiet efficiency. She wrapped leftover cake for the district nurse, tied the Ruby Redemption Fund envelope with ribbon, and placed Miss Hart's book on the mantel beside her nephew's letters. She poured one final cup of tea, added a slice of lemon, and raised it to the fire. "To Christmas," she toasted, "to paste and truth, to St. Mary Mead, where every mystery ends in morning tea." Outside, the bells pealed joy to the world. Children laughed under the tree. The paste ruby winked in the sunlight, perfect, flawless, and utterly gloriously false. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, click, 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 and began a new scarf. Damson wool, for the vicar's wife. The pattern was simple: one stitch of honesty, one stitch of kindness, repeat to the end.